Hello everyone, this is part 21 of What If Naruto Got Lost During His Training TS, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Previously on Lost. After saying that, he felt his three friends transcend through the boundaries between world and went back home to report to Kyonshi and watch Juashu's progress. I really hope they can get those armies to attack home. Juashu thought as he continued his time-warping trek back to Juashu Aoju. The war had been progressing nicely, all the 9 lands were suffering from the attacks of Juashu's armies. His 9 generals immediately began their assaults on the cities, town, villages, and armies of the daimyos of each of the 9 lands. They each proclaimed that it was by the will of Rosuto Juashu that they would rid each of the 9 lands of their present governments, unifying all the lands under one banner, that of Rosuto Juashu. These proclamations, added to the fact that in each battle in which the daimyos' armies engaged in Juashu's armies triumphed, enraged the 9 daimyos enough to force them into an alliance of sorts with one another. Their collective prides be damned, they would get rid of this new threat, and indeed Juashu was a threat, then return to the ways things were before the arrival of these invaders. While Juashu's 9 generals and the armies under their commands were harassing the lands in which they were based in, Juashu too was kept busy with preparations for what he deemed as the final battle. The one fight to end all fights, or at least for the next 1,000 years. That's the thing with these people, they have a thing for the number 9, 3, 7, and 1,000. Well, Juashu was ready to implement his plan, all that he was waiting for was for the armies of the 9 lands to have the bulk of the remainder of their main forces to attack the capital of the recently revealed Rosuto no Kuni, Juashu Aoju. Juashu had a few thousand troops to march from Juashu Aoju and make their way to the 9 lands to increase attacks on the resident daimyos. They were also tasked with spreading information that Juashu was in his city, that he was literally looking down on the other daimyos. He appeared like he could not be bothered to really worry about the other 9. His base of operations was so impenetrable that he did not need the bulk of his army to defend it, or even be anywhere near it. Juashu needed the daimyos' prides to be burned, and be burned badly. They would be forced to believe that they too did not need to overly fortify their capitals and bases. Juashu would then somehow implant the thought that the best way of ridding the lands of the threat of Rosuto no Kuni would be a decisive battle, one that the 9 lands armies would have around the walls of Juashu Aoju. If you take out the head, the body will fall apart. Of course, Juashu would also use this tactic. The egos of the 9 lords were big enough for them to believe that their armies were all that were needed to defeat Juashu. They would leave their capitals undefended. When that would happen, Juashu would strike. He would travel to all 9 capitals and do battle with the daimyos, one-on-one. They would not expect that. They would at first feel a sense of security since Juashu would have his armies cease all attacks on the 9 lands, and make it look like they were rushing back to Juashu Aoju once the information that the 9 lands armies were heading for their capital, and for the head of the daimyo. With this false sense of security, Juashu would make his move, he would enact his surprise attack. When the attacks would happen, he would be in 10 places at the exact same time. He would make sure that his battles were as visible as possible. He would finally get to let loose. His bases in the 9 lands could serve as the capitals of his future 9 provinces. The present capitals would be damaged to the point that they would not be fit to be capitals. The only city that wouldn't suffer that much damage would be Sakura no Kuni's capital, due to Juashu having a house there. In Komugi no Kuni, Yuji was busy burning the wheat fields one after the other. The dragons of myth and legend helping him in his quest in making people believe that the gods were angry, and were siding with the Rosuto forces. Dragons, terrible beasts and creatures of legend. Yuji had his dragons, as well as the elemental constructs, not just burn fields but also eat people, virgins, children, and the like, most of which were just clones, but the locals of Komugi didn't need to know that. By following the daimyo they were dooming themselves to a life of death. To the daimyo it was a message that the Rosuto forces meant business. It didn't matter how the dragons came to be there, all that mattered was that there were dragons and they were terrorizing the countryside. The elemental dragons were the worst of the lot. Along with the wheat fields, the weather herself kept changing, the seasons were extremely irregular. Due to the influence any dragons had on the weather, it would rain cats and dogs one day, then be as dry as a desert the next. Supply routes were continuously remapped, some were completely abandoned, labeled as S-lands, due to the earthquakes that some of the dragons induced. Aside from the harassing and whatnot that Yuji was in charge of, he was also given the privilege, like the other generals, of knowing some of Juashu's plans. Yuji was in charge of terraforming Komugi no Kuni, as were the other 8 generals with their own respective lands. Juashu was having the 9 lands reformed, it was going to literally be a rebirth. Like some of the phoenixes that Juashu had encountered in his training, his land, Rosuto no Kuni, would join with the 9 lands. Out of the ashes of war another greater country would rise. Rosuto no Kuni would be that country, one that was totally different from what it still was. Juashu planned on having almost every kind of land mass or terrain in his country, as well as almost every and any body of water that he could fit into the county as well. The land would be a new world, as well as a lost world that would be sealed away from the rest of the world for 1,000 years, only allowing minor glimpses of its splendor to be seen by the outside world. While Yuji was busy laying the smackdown in Komugi with the tails of dragons in his vast arsenal of teeth, claws and mystical and mythical might, Tamatsu was busy having the Onagumo and the Oni-Sasori, otherwise known as Juashu's pet spiders and scorpions, swallowing the sands of Tenshi. There was just too much sand there, some of it would be transported somehow to other parts of the country during the rebirth, but for now it was just too much. Also the sand connected the land of Kase no Kuni. Juashu needed to separate the lands from the other lands that were not affected by the wars. While Tamatsu was not overseeing the sand-sucking and harassment of the natives of Tenshi which Magoi was usually overseeing, he was busy overseeing the defenses against the sandfish that had somehow found their way to the Sea of Sand. There weren't too many of them, but there were enough of them to be hazardous to the health of Rosuto and Tenshi residents alike. Tamatsu had been successful in obtaining a few carcasses of those monstrous things. But there was still a number of them out there. Tamatsu had also noticed the gradual appearance of a number of creatures that he had never encountered or thought existed. When he consulted Magoi, he was told that they were creatures from another time and place, that had decided to come up and make themselves known. If the lands were to experience a rebirth, the land would even gain some of these emerging creatures. Too bad that the battle cats loved hunting the smaller things. Naruto and Mori were an inseparable duo, it didn't matter that they were married to one another, where one went the other would follow, most it was Mori doing all the following. Naruto was usually at the front of the army that was engaging the resident army. It was chaos reminiscent of Uzumaki Naruto during his pranking days. Her attacks weren't all that sly, but the number of things that she could pull out of her magician's hat were quite frightening. While Magoi had the forces just harass, attack, and stuff. Naruto went out of her way to scare the living out of the Tenshi army. The devils of the battlefield had met their match in ferocity. Mori was just there to make sure that nothing bad happened to his wife, not that much could get near her. Unlike his wife, Mori was the one who constantly found himself in trouble, always needing to be rescued. For one reason or another, he had a habit of finding his way into messes that he could not figure a way out of. He'd had his head nearly bitten off. It was only due to the timely intervention of Tamatsu and his sandfish hunting party that Mori's heads were still attached to his body. His arms were nearly severed on a few occasions. One time Mori had accidentally peeked at a hot spring somewhere in Tenshi, and due to the giggling of another peeker, an intentional one, he was caught up in the mad stampede of women that wanted to take his heads off. A sandfish was one thing, but a horde of L-hating women was another thing. After narrowly escaping certain doom, the other guy bribed Mori with an orange little book that was obviously not for children. The guy who gave it to him thought that he was a fellow skirt chaser. In memory of their meeting, the book was an autographed copy. There were also a number of preservation seals placed on it, so that Mori could make it some sort of family heirloom or something. Once Naruto found out about the book, Mori had to hide from his wife. He spent 2 weeks constantly being in the presence of Tamatsu, because for some reason Magoi and his fellows sided with Naruto. Eventually the book was forgotten, but somehow Juashu found out about it and well, Tamatsu and Mori had more things to worry about. Juashu sent a chicken carrying chicken pox to the base. Most of the people there suffered a week's worth of pox due to Mori's little mishap. Naruto and the clones were the only ones saved from the ordeal due to certain immunities. After that incident, the men of the Tenchi base realized that their being ls should be kept hidden and safe behind closed doors, as well as only seen by their wives. Who knew that Juashu could send a plague spawned from AC of all things to torment ls? The book was not confiscated, just that Mori was informed that should he ever encounter the guy that gave him the book again to somehow capture him so that Juashu could have his wicked ways with him, not in the LD sense mind you. While Tamatsu dealt with the intricacies of placating monsters in the desert and with Yuji playing with mythological fire, Sunio was busy orchestrating massive plays, shows, and the like in Sakura no Kuni. His newfound mastery of Kagutsu no Jutsu was terrifying. The puppet corps was one of the most feared of all the corps in the Rosuto army. Sakura no Kuni had several smaller bases littering the whole of it, all of which were commanded by one puppet master. Monzaemon had gifted his prized puppets to one of his pupils, one of the ones that had, after mastering puppetry to a more than acceptable level, chosen to return to their clan, and teach the art of puppetry to their relatives. With the pupil and her clansmen, the story of Chikamatsu Monzaemon and the destructive power of puppets would be brought to the dunes of Kase no Kuni, where in the future Kagutsu no Jutsu would be one of the world's most coveted arts. That is of course until Juashu and Monzaemon reared their handsome back into the reality of the rest of the continent. Sunio's forces had managed to infiltrate every single place in Sakura no Kuni. With the mastery over puppets, the puppet masters were also allowed to go about their terraforming at a much faster pace as compared to the other lands, save for Komugi. Those were only a few of the things that were going on in the 9 lands, most of the things that were occurring in the other lands were the same. Well, maybe except for Sakana no Kuni, where things were upside down and inside out, due to the chaos that swept through the land due to the actions and whims of Rosuto Naruto, who was always followed by his wife Amiko just to make sure that he didn't do anything that would endanger the people, or spook them into thinking that they were better off with the daimyo instead of with the forces of Rosuto Juashu. Naruto was a sadistic madman, finding pleasure in scaring the living daylights out of his enemies, and his brother-in-law. Having Tama be sent to Juashu's location via Croc was just one of the tamer things that he had done. Some of the more dangerous and sadistic things consisted of paint, and lots of paint. Some of the Sakana soldiers had SD due to being painted in too much orange. The color was just too bright for them to handle. Some of the special water that was the predecessor of hero water, was kawarimied with blue paint. Naruto had an unhealthy obsession with paint. The only way to calm him down was with 10 bowls of ramen, and the presence of his wife, any other time and he was as mad as the Mad Hatter. But of course there were times that he was all business. During the planning stages of attacks, the man was a complete stiff. The guy acted like one of those old army generals that had seen too many battles and such. It was creepy how the guy came up with strategies on the fly. Toru was the complete opposite of his brother-in-law. He was all business during operations, but during planning and while not doing anything, the guy could literally be found doing nothing. Some of his best friends were guys from a branch of a clan that loved the phrase or word troublesome. Among the 3 leaders of Sakana, Amiko was the most normal of the 3, she kept the 2 males in line. She never encountered any dangerous situation that she couldn't get out of, and she made sure that everyone was okay. She was the chief medical officer or surgeon general of the Sakana bases. She would sometimes become a scarier and younger version of Tsunade, complete with super punching action. Naruto made the plans, Toru implemented the plans, and Amiko made sure that the plans succeeded. That was how the Rosuto forces in Sakana worked. But when they did mess up, there was always a backup plan that would have already been prepared by Toru's troublesome friends. Gimen Ryu and the medical corps of the Nasu group were known far and wide as the damned best medical practitioners in the 9 lands. Some soldiers defected from their countries in order to seek medical aid from Ryu and his group. The Komugi defectors and traitors worshipped the group upon which Ryu walked on due to the fact that the Nasu base was in the mountains with hundreds of dragons, ranging from eggs to adults. The Komugi natives always brought wheat and other products of the earth whenever they visited the base or even if they were assigned to the base, they offered these things to Ryu who just added them to the stocks and stores of the Nasu group. The dragons didn't really care much for the wheat and stuff, they just found it amusing that so many humans found them quite frightening. Ryu was the go-to general when there was a need for medics or medical supplies. While his generals were busy with the daily activities, Juashu had his troops in the capital prepare for battle. He didn't know exactly when the battle was going to take place, but he would make sure that it would happen days before the anniversary. He made sure that all the trebuchets, catapults, and ballistas were armed and ready for anything at any time. All the gears were oiled regularly to keep them in working condition. The civilians and other citizens of Rosuto no Kuni could see their leader walking on the walls, and in 9 other parts of the city at the same time, doing routine inspections and the like. What the regular people didn't know was that there were clones of Juashu everywhere, doing this and that in preparation for the final defensive battle. One of things that the people noticed that Juashu didn't seem to mind were those pranksters that ran around the city, pulling pranks left and right. While the recipients of the pranks didn't find them all that funny, the other people were reminded that even though there was a war going on beyond the walls, the people should keep happy. Juashu understood that even in times of war, there was always time for fun. What the people didn't know was 9 times out of 10, the pranks were not pulled by the youth or someone like that, but by Juashu himself. Even their leader needed to cut loose. One time Juashu painted his castle keep in rainbow colors, and the mountain in a clownish motif. At first the people feared that the pranksters had gone too far, that is until they saw their leader fall off a wall laughing his ass off. The paint was easily removed. The cleanup was done by the troublemakers in the city, as well as some soldiers as a training exercise. That big prank was blamed on a quartet of men that some had spotted running for their lives here and there on the mountain. Aside from the quartet, there were also sightings of a number of larger-than-life creatures that the cleanup crew had never encountered. These things were spotted chasing the quartet. When Juashu encountered the group, he sent them flying into a cave which housed some onegumo. That was the only time that the people of the cleanup crew found their leader do something slightly sadistic, which was evident with the malicious glint in his eyes, and the maniacal laughter that escaped his lips as the shrieks of fear reached their ears and one by one down, until there was silence. The cleanup crew actually thought that they were to become some kind of ritual to the onegumo, but were relieved when their leader bunny hopped away while singing the happy birthday song to himself. The date of the incident was October 10. While the Rosuto forces were experiencing success after success, and the leaders were able to enjoy themselves, the daimyos of the 9 lands were not having a good time. Their resources were being depleted, their contacts in the black market were vanishing off of the face of the earth, and they were losing troops fast. They had to make an offensive move. They had been at war with one another but, for the first time they agreed that they would send their armies to attack Juashu. They knew that it could be found at the intersecting point of all of their lands. All their armies were to march and arrive at the exact same time. Their decision to go on this campaign was due to the information had been spread throughout the lands that the base of the Rosuto forces was only defended by walls, and a handful of soldiers. It was finally time to decapitate the Rosuto threat. This meeting of lords happened within hearing range of Yahiko, in Naya no Kuni. After all the plans were made, and everything was confirmed to be true, Yahiko sent word to Juashu that the daimyos were making their move. Once the news reached him, Juashu informed all his forces that they were to gradually stop all their attacks. The final battle was approaching. He ordered his generals to spread out all troops in the lands, and prepare for something. What that something was they were not informed, not even Tsukiko who had stolen Juashu's heart. It was 1 month before the anniversary of the Wars of the 9 Lands, that the armies that participated in those wars arrived to the site of the most heavily defended city that they had ever and would ever see. The scouts of the armies reported that the walls were not only high, but were filled to the brim with soldiers. Most of the ones that were seen were archers. On top of the walls there was a wall of archers standing shoulder to shoulder, with their bows and arrows at the ready. The attackers had come somewhat prepared. They managed to copy the designs of the siege weapons that the Rosuto forces used to defend their bases, and sometimes attack. The attackers had cruder but working versions of the mounted defenses of Juashu's walls. The defenders just stood still, waiting for the order to let their arrows fly. The majors also waited for the signal to send out their attacks. On the northernmost part of the outer wall, on top of the gate, facing the generals of the armies stood Rosuto Juashu. Standing defiantly, facing his foes. Some of the troops in the armies of the 9 lands thought that the leader of Rosuto no Kuni was a very sly bastard, that deserved what they were sent there to do. The daimyos of their lands never went out of their way to be seen on the battlefield, and here was the leader of their enemy, mocking them. The generals collectively saw Juashu's mere presence as an insult. They refused to believe that one man could stand up to the might of 9 nations that had successfully gone to war with one another for almost 1,000 years, with none of them getting the upper hand. The generals assumed that the wall defenders were mostly civilians, only a few of which were actual soldiers. From the information that they were given, the Rosuto capital city only had a handful of soldiers, but little did they know that the definition of a handful was way different from Juashu's definition of a handful. None of the wall defenders were civilians. All the defenders were trained military personnel. When the attackers decided to charge, the archers were ordered to hold their attacks. The attackers, after entering the range of the arrows, became even more aggressive. Their pride and egos were boosted since they believed that the defenders feared for their lives and refused to attack due to that fear. This was another sense of false security and victory that Juashu had planned on instilling in the heads of the attackers. Once the attackers were able to clearly see the defenders, they were surprised at what they found. Some of them tried to retreat, but the charging others that had not yet been able to witness the horror of what the walls had, forced all of them forward. On the walls, the wall of archers made it known that there were actually 3 rows of them, or 3 tiers. The front row were crouched, the middle row were kneeling, and the back row were standing. Once a third of the charging army had seen the sheer number of wall defenders, the rest of the charging soldiers witnessed the sky go dark due to the sheer number of arrows that filled the afternoon sky. If that wasn't enough to scare the attackers, the wave upon wave of fireballs that impacted with soldier upon soldier should have. Aside from the Kaiten, Hosenka no jutsus that were fired into the army via the jutsu clones, the mages, both clones and people, summoned earth golems, which they controlled to attack the attackers closest to the walls. Half of the charging troops managed to survive the onslaught. They used their fallen comrades as shields. No respect for the S whatsoever. As soon as they returned to the rest of the armies, they along with the others witnessed the earth swallowing the S boss whole. The only evidence that AM had taken place was the scorched earth and the earth golems that had tumbled in on themselves. The generals then decided to use their long-range weapons, as well as the siege towers that they had at the disposal. The generals refused to acknowledge that the defenders were any good, they just assumed that what occurred was a fluke. So they rolled out the towers, and long-range weapons. Once they were within range of the walls, they just fired at the walls, throwing flaming rocks and regular rocks at the walls. What they didn't expect was for an invisible barrier to stop the rocks from damaging the walls, as well as stop the ballista bolts from harming the defenders. The attackers paid this no mind, they just continued with their attacking. The defenders, getting fed up with the pointless attacks, after waiting for hours for the attackers to tire, decided that it was time to retaliate. Without an order being issued from Juashu, the mounted defenses let loose their own volleys. The attackers answered the attacks with more attacks on their part, as well as sending some more infantry to try and scale the walls with ladders and such. The wall's defenders stuck to their attacks. All of them believed that the defense was indestructible and impenetrable, which Juashu knew that it wasn't. The weak points of the defensive barriers was the mana supply of the mages, the walls were weakest near the gates. The defenders just kept defending, while the attackers just kept attacking. The month had almost ended, and the anniversary was almost upon them. That was when Juashu made his move. He had been just observing his troops defend their home, his home. He had not participated in the defensive battle. But now that it was nearing the anniversary, he was finally going to go on the offensive. In full view of the people around him, he split himself into 10. These were not clone constructs, but actual duplicates of himself. He had literally divided himself into 10 parts, 9 of which wore an armband on their arms bearing the kanji of a number and shu. The numbers ranged from 1 to 9. The 10th one's armband had the kanji for Juu and Shu, 10 and Master. Juashu was like Rokudu no Senin, one soul many boss. Body number 1 jumped off the wall and became the earth. He would then come out outside the capital of Naya no Kuni. Body number 2 jumped off the wall and became the wind. He would then materialize outside the capital of Nasu no Kuni. Body number 3 jumped off the wall and became water. He traveled as the vapor and moisture in the air, and would later condense outside of the capital of Tetsu. Body number 4 jumped off the wall and became fire. He burst into flames and traveled underground veins of the world, and would later erupt like a volcano outside of the capital of Sakura no Kuni. Body number 5 jumped off the wall and shimmered out of sight. He joined the sunlight and would shimmer back into solidity outside the capital of Tenshi no Kuni. Body number 6 jumped off the wall and flew to the heavens via a sudden bolt of lightning. He would later scorch the earth outside the capital of Komugi no Kuni as a lighting ignites the spot that he would appear on. Body number 7 jumped off the wall and became one with the shadow. He would later walk out of the shadow of a tree outside the capital of Sakana no Kuni. Body number 8 jumped off the wall and puffed into smoke. As the smoke blew away on the ground, a withered log would be found in place of the body. He instantly appeared outside the capital of Nairan no Kuni beside a fallen tree. Body number 9 walked off the wall and just vanished. He sealed away his body and detached his spirit. He would later reunite with his body outside the capital of Sakihin no Kuni. Body number 10 jumped off the wall and landed on the ground. He vanished his cloak, and removed his shirt. Then he released the seals that lined his body, some of them glowing and looked like tattoos. He then drew his katana with one hand, then held his enlarged kunai in the other. Then with a thunderous roar, that was echoed by the heavens, he charged the enemy. The wall defenders were astonished at the feats that their leader had performed before their very eyes. But quickly their amazement and astonishment turned into shock that their leader himself was running towards the enemy with only 2 blades to defend himself. The armies of the 9 lands thought that the man had lost his mind, so they readied themselves for the K that was coming their way. But with the thought that he had turned into a madman, the soldiers would have to be more cautious, because there was nothing more dangerous than one of the demented that fought with reckless abandon. The soldiers on the walls began to panic. Some of the ones nearest the gate were frantically opening the gates, some others didn't bother waiting for the gates to be fully opened. As soon as a small opening was formed, some of the foot soldiers ran out after their leader to defend him. Even though they thought that he had lost his mind, he was still their leader. The clones that were among the wall defenders didn't even wait for the gates to open. They jumped or leapt off of the walls and ran in different directions to directly engage the enemy. This action surprised the people even more. The clones were distinguishable by the bands or patches that bore the kanji of one of the number 1 to 9. The people in the city heard roars, greater in number and just as powerful as the first one. As they looked up, they saw the flights of dragons and rocks flying over the city heading in the direction of the attackers. As soon as the gates were fully opened, the cavalry made a break for it. Their leader was already halfway to the attacking army. The running infantry was not even that close. The attackers witnessed the skyline in the direction and surrounding the walled city grow dark. They could make out a number of shapes in the sky. Some of the soldiers that had encountered the dragons and rocks instantly knew what they were. The terrors from the skies, the 2 things that they could barely defend against, were heading their way. The generals and officers immediately started barking out orders for the long-range weapons to be armed and ready, the infantry to prepare. The goal was to take out as many of the charging defenders as they could. Just when they thought that it couldn't get any worse, some of the forward scouts sent word back to the rest of the army that the cavalry did not only consist of men on horses, but battle cats, direwolves, onisasori and onagumo, and a few other things that the men and women of Rosuto no Kuni had managed to tame. As the dragons and rocks flew over some of the scouting parties nearer to the wall, the scouts noticed a peculiar things. The dragons and rocks were moving at a slower pace than normal. It was as if they were delaying their attack for some reason, as if they were giving the 9 lands a chance to prepare themselves for AS. Another thing that they noticed was that every dragon was somewhat holding onto a croc, one of those super crocs. Those crocs were known for having hides that were harder than diamonds. The dragons resembled bombers, their bombs being these super crocs. The scouts swiftly sent word to the armies about the impending doom that was going to befall them. The slowly encroaching numbers were creeping the attackers out. Some of them were thinking of surrendering or simply running away. But the number that chose to stay and fight were just as many. They all thought that it was better to fight than run and be viewed as a coward. If they won, hooray; if they lost, and would most likely be killed if they managed to survive the battle anyway. It was war. It wasn't like the Rosuto forces were just aiming to incapacitate or knock them out or something like that. Beneath the walls were a number of sewer holes. Most people thought that those holes were just so that the sewer water could escape to go wherever such waters went. The truth was what the wall defenders that didn't rush out witnessed. From out of the holes emerged snakes and serpents of all colors and sizes. The most prominent ones being basilisks. The officers on the walls knew about the basilisks. Not all the soldiers knew of them or anything about them for that matter, but the officers all knew. The basilisks lined the walls waiting, while the other smaller snakes and serpents shirred their way towards the enemy. The officers ordered some of the archers to jump on the serpents' backs, they would provide long-range support for their comrades. The officers handed out satchels of poison for the archers to use. The poison was not lethal but had paralyzing effects. Some of the poisons that were handed out would knock the ones hit by the arrows unconscious. Oh, how wrong the attackers were. They wouldn't be ked if they lost. Something much more would be taken from them. Their identities. Their identities as citizens of the Nine Lands would cease to be who they were. Instead they would be citizens of Rosuto no Kuni and mere residents of the 9 provinces. Each basilisk had around 15 archers on their backs, the serpents themselves using their own innate chakra to hold the archers onto their backs. The basilisks knew more about chakra than the rest of the populace. It wasn't really all that fair. The sheer number of units that Juashu had deployed was more than enough to make half of the attackers to S themselves. The living had been scared out of most of them, the others were waiting for the S to be scared out of them. Once the 10th body of Rosuto Juashu finally reached the attackers, he let out another roar, the thunderous echo of the heavens answering his call. The dragons and rocks heard it, and dived at the attackers, dropping those big-ass hell crocs on the soldiers of the 9 lands. The crocs too had some basic understanding on how to use and manipulate their chakra. They used what control they had to make sure that the soldiers they landed on were not S but just somewhat comatose, with the possibility of revival if one of Gim and Ryu's medical corps saw to them. The dragons belched out hailstones and snowballs that flew into the ranks of the enemy, knocking over 5 or more people at a time. The rocks and their riders darted in and out of the battlefield, picking up unconscious and otherwise incapacitated soldiers, and swiftly brought them to just outside the walls of the city, where medics had set up a kind of field hospital. The Rosuto leader mowed his way into the attackers, slicing tendons, and whacking people into darkness left and right. The only people that would S were the generals, and some of the people whose hearts were as cold as or if not colder than ice. He knew this due to one of the powers that he had cultivated through training. His troops would know who to take out and who to just knock out. How? Well, they would just get this feeling in the guts. The beasts were kinda more in tune with the world around them, so they more or less could sense these things, so Juashu didn't need to manipulate anything for them to follow the plan. The Rosuto leader was laughing while he was doing the bloody work that he was doing. He was dancing on the battlefield, utilizing his kenjutsu training and implementing non-lethal attacks. The clones were a rabid bunch on pranksters on the battlefield. Most of the things that those units were known for by the other soldiers were not apparent in the way that the clones were knocking people out. Water balloons, paint bombs, smoke bombs, stink bombs, dung bombs, candy canes, dango, confetti, and other such things were flying everywhere. The clones moved in groups of 5, one was always on the lookout for danger while the other 4 made a party out of the fighting. The soldiers of the armies of the 9 lands were even more frightened once they realized how the clones were fighting. They were pranking people on the battlefield with such ease, grace, and speed, that it was more than just creepy or scary. The clones were on a literal and figurative sugar high. They were bouncing all over the place, on each other, on their human comrades, on the attackers. They were even somehow, to the astonishment to their allies, able to convince the crocs into playing baseball with them, bombs and balloons instead of balls. The clones that were on the dragons were creeping out the human riders with them, due to the things that they were doing to the snowballs and hail balls that were flying out of the dragons' mouths. Ever seen a rainbow-colored snowball? Well, those riders saw a lot of spherical rainbows. Some of the dragon riders were helping the rocks and their riders in collecting the knocked-out people, as well as any injured that they came across. The dragons did not swoop down. The clones bungee jumped off of the dragons' backs, and retrieved these downed foes and friends. The clones were literal loons. It wasn't a battle to them and their creator, it was a party. The only thing missing were the drinks, cake, and party hats. The basilisks formed a perimeter around the city, with the archers on their backs knocking people out forwards, backwards, left, right, up, down. Upon seeing the clones and their antics, they just shook their head, or hissed in amusement. Some of the smaller snakes that were with them traded places with the poison-tipped arrow and flew through the air, then impaling their fangs into the body parts of the enemy. The archers didn't really notice, that was until a small basilisk was loaded onto a ballista by a group of clones. The foot soldiers that caught up with their leader were too tired to even lift their swords, but it would have been of no use, the man was just too fast for them to keep up. The chaos that the arrows, the dragons, crocs, and the rest were just too much for them to handle. So they just plopped on the ground, watched the fireworks, Fireworks that were flying into the night sky, which were being set off by the riders of the scorpions and the spiders. A few minutes after the fireworks started, someone dropped off a keg of beer and a drum of sake near them, along with some of the dango that weren't thrown hither and thither. A few more minutes after the arrival of drinks and food, the soldiers saw some of the clones actually wearing party hats. When one approached, they were given some hats to wear themselves. By that time, some of the beasts were sporting hats of their own. The battle was drawing to a close. This was evident when Rosuto Juashu himself plopped down beside one soldier wearing a party hat. Their esteemed leader had a party hat of his own on. It was a few hours till the anniversary hit. Lunchtime was the exact time or hour in which he wars all started, but the citizens and soldiers of Rosuto no Kuni were already partying as if they had already won the war. The only thing that they were waiting for was word from the other lands of liberation from the rulers. While the 10th body did his thing, the first body had also engaged his enemy in battle. The daimyo of Naya was a master swordsman in his own right. None of the daimyos were pushovers to begin with, each of them had a strength all their own. Juashu's katana clashed with that of the Naya daimyo. Sparks flew each time the two blades met. It was a battle to the death, one in which Juashu would not and could not lose. The battle began in the bedchambers of the daimyo, just after he had had his morning rituals and such. It was a good thing that he had his katana nearby, else Juashu would not have had his really explosive fight. The battle was long and drawn out. It wasn't as nuts as the large-scale defensive battle that the 10th body was fighting in. It was one filled with skill and precision. Serious expressions were on the faces of the two men. The two men moved as one with their blades, their swords being just an extension of their arms, just another part of their boss that were moved in certain ways and could be used to perform certain actions. It was a battle not only of skills but also of wills. Juashu employed his chakra and chi to power his attacks, while the daimyo used his chi and ki to the same effect. The two fighters were nearly evenly matched in skill. Juashu did not want to mock his opponent. He wanted his opponent to think that he had given it his all, and when he had SD with all honor intact. A similar battle had been going on in Nasu no Kuni, Komugi no Kuni, Sakana no Kuni, and Sakihin no Kuni. The battles were between two men, fighting for the continued existence, with all the honor that they held. In Tetsu no Kuni, Juashu had to deal with, not a katana-wielding daimyo but a battle hammer-wielding one. The battle was not just one of SK, but one of strength and will as well. Each hammer swing was blocked with the flat of the katana, each katana slash was blocked by the end of the hammer. Aside from the weapons doing battle, there were some kicks and punches in there as well. The daimyo's castle had been partially destroyed, when Juashu was finally able to fell his foe. The brute had given it his all, but he had made the one mistake that should not be made in a fight. He turned his back on the enemy, and Juashu, having a shinobi background, capitalized on this one opening. Sakura no Kuni was somewhat similar in the battle situation to Tetsu, the difference being that the daimyo was more of a master of speed than anything else, and his weapon of choice was a spiked whip rather than a hammer or a blade. The whip was made by an incredibly durable and fine material, that Juashu's blade was for some reason unable to cut. The weapons of the two combatants never made contact. There was a lot of dodging, running, and jumping involved in the fight, as well as thrown and toppled objects. Just like the other castles, part of it would take a few years to repair. The speed, agility, and reflexes aided the Sakura daimyo in fighting gracefully as if he was dancing in the air. Juashu too was dancing. Trough the different openings that the battle had blown open in the walls of the castle, Sakura petal were brought in by the wind. No matter how anyone looked at it, the battle was both beautiful and still sly. The battle ended when Juashu decided that enough was enough, and ended the daimyo's life by suffocation. He mummified the daimyo with Sakura petals. The battle in Tenshi no Kuni was also one of speed, but also of precision. The attacks, slashes, strikes, and the like that were delivered and employed by each fighter were lightning quick. Sadame, being a woman, was very graceful and agile, but so was one who once held a kitsune. Juashu met each attack with one of his own. The two rivals for power attacked with such speed that power was not a factor that was needed. Vacs in here were formed after every attack, some of which were strong enough to mess up the surrounding area. The two fighters battled it out, on the roof, in rooms, in th kitchen. They just moved, and moved and moved. Sadame proved why the warriors of Tenshi were devils on the battlefield. Her lightning-quick attacks showed off her ferocity. The vacs in the air were like the spells that devils and demons cast. The two fought for supremacy in a battle akin to a chaos storm. The spectators of the fight could not interfere. One thing their pride and honor would not let them. Another thing was that they feared for their lives at how sly the dance looked. Mori looked on and watched as his mother became a devil. Tamatsu looked on as he watched his friend and lord join wind and lightning. The end of the battle happened on one of the roofs of what was left of the castle. Sudane was not struck down in any way by Juashu. She tripped and fell to her death, impaling herself with her own blade on the way down. What set the battle in Niran apart from the rest was that it was a 2-on-1 battle. The double daimyos against Juashu. The descendants of the brothers that had plunged their land in war over some matter that was rarely discussed fought with 2 katanas each, while Juashu fought with his 1 katana and his kunai. Tama looked on and watched the clash of the tans. The double daimyos were sword masters to the degree that due to being extremely familiar with each other's styles they were able to work as one body and one mind against Juashu. They had the strength, the speed, the agility, the reflexes, the precision, the SK, the control, and the will to fight on even footing with Juashu. This was the only battle where Juashu had to force himself to heal slower. It wouldn't do if the whole world knew that he could instantly heal himself. He suffered many cuts due to the 4 blades that he was facing off against. An insane battle of life and death. Juashu was unable to move behind the duo due to one guarding the other's back. Juashu also had to guard his own back. He couldn't summon up a clone to fight by his side, since it needed to look like he did it all by himself. Not everyone knew about clones of any kind. The world was still inhabited by shinobi clans that kept the secret of ninjutsu, genjutsu and chakra to themselves. Juashu couldn't bring out his aces in this battle. He had to fight with all that he could humanly possibly use. The duo fought like brothers, like twins, like peas in a pod. They were born to battle side by side. Their blades even looked to have been made with the same fire, by the same smiths. These were possibly the reason as to why each of their factions could never overpower the other. The anniversary was nearing. Juashu knew that his other boss had already ended the battles. He had to end his as soon as possible. He decided to take a leaf out of the life of his old self's book. He did something entirely reckless and stupid. Something that would leave normal people lying on the ground. He let himself be impaled by the 4 blades. The shock of the action allowed an opening which, through the pain Juashu used and struck, his blades piercing the hearts of the 2 relatives. Tama rushed to his side and slid the blades out. He was signaled one of his subordinates to inform the capital of the win. The people around were buzzing like bees talking about the fight. The wars had ended and Rosuto no Kuni had won. Tama had the privilege of patching his lord up, bandaging him like a mummy, even though Juashu kept protesting that he was fine, in a bit of pain, but fine. Tama would have none of it and told his lord that if he kept complaining his mouth would fall off or some such drivel. On the exact second it was announced that Rosuto no Kuni was made up of the unification of the 9 lands. Rosuto Juashu had won. The party hit an all-time high. All over the ashes that once was 9, a phoenix rose and was born Rosuto no Kuni. The land itself had changed after the announcement. The barriers that would block out the rest of the world for 1,000 years would not rise, until Juashu made it so. There was a lot of repopulating to be done. A lot of displaced and separated families to reunite. All of it would take place after the party, and things had settled down. The celebration lasted for a month, and in some places even more. But the highlight of it all was when the 10 boss merged back into one. The 10th body put on his shirt, and donned his cloak, then walked steadily back to the city. As he walked the people around him saw the different thing happen one after the other. The first thing that happened was that the 9th body appeared out of nowhere and just melted into the walking form. A few meters later the 7th Odi made its appearance via a shadow on the ground crept its way towards walking one. The shadow on the ground resembled a running man, that pounced suddenly on the walking one. A few more meters later the 6th body joined the 10th. The body did not openly manifest, but like the shadow it just struck, literally like lightning from the blue. A few more meters a body shimmered into existence then just merged with the 10th body. Another few meters and another one, then another one. A fireball engulfed the 10th body, then a one-spot torrential rain, followed by a tornado, then the earth rose up before him and swallowed him whole only to spit him back out. The best of these events was the last one. The people had counted the return of only 8 boss. Where was the 9th one they all wondered. Juashu's 10th body was a few feet from the gates when suddenly an elemental dragon made of earth rose up from the ground, with a fire dragon following in its wake. From the clouds above a lightning dragon shot out, followed by a water one. The last elemental dragon to appear was the wind one. Another tornado made itself known. Out of the whirling vortex came the 5th dragon. These 5 elemental dragons flew on their own aided by some form of magic, then slammed into the 10th body, finally making it whole. The process of being accepted back into the hole took just enough time for Juashu to enter the gate of the city. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.